We've got most of our rendering done, and as I mentioned earlier, I wasn't really happy with the way that the wheels turned out, and so in this section we will look at how to add the details of the wheels. We'll apply some of the stuff that we learned earlier on with copy and rotate. But what I've done is I've pulled the original wheel detail up to the top layer, and I've created another layer on top of that to put in these pie pieces to try and subdivide this thing into 8 sections. And I'll sketch it out, then fill that area, but I won't add any shadow or highlight until I've copied and rotated each of these elements and put them, cleaned them up and put them on both wheels. Since the highlights and the shadows will change, if we were to add it now, then the highlights and shadows would not be correct, as the highlights and shadows would rotate as we rotated each of these elements around the wheel. You can see that the tolerance wasn't quite right, so I'll adjust that tolerance and have to go in, I'll just fill it up with the paintbrush. And I'm going to merge those two layers together and clean this up just a little bit. Now what I noticed was that my details didn't quite fit here, and so what I will do is I'll actually trim that detail up and add a little bit more of a reference point to help me with my rotation. So just with that eraser tool, I'll slim this detail up. You'll notice I put just another small circle that I'll end up erasing later that is in line with the subdivided circle. Now I've got a reference place to then grab this, copy it, rotate it, and put it in place. Here I'm going to speed it up a little bit quicker. Feel free to fast forward because this process takes just a few minutes. And we've covered the basics of how to do it. Here I know that I've got all 4 in place, and I can grab all 4 of those, copy and paste them, and rotate them 180 degrees and put them in place, and then finish up this portion by grabbing all 8 and copying and pasting them over to the other wheel. Because all of these details are on the same layer, I can lock my transparency and come in and add highlights. And I'm assuming a light source that is up and maybe over my left shoulder as the observer. Of course, some of this we won't see because we'll end up either moving it behind or to a lower layer than that chain guard, or we'll just erase what we don't want. Here I'm grabbing that layer and moving it below the other details that I've already added. And I'll just go in and erase those small circles that I created to help line everything up. Here what I'm doing is I want to refill the entire wheel. And so I'm adding circles in there so that I can use the fill tool to do so. Now I'm using the layer specific fill tool. I'll lock the transparency and add somewhat of a domed effect as soon as I erase what I don't want here. And since I had created the earlier color for inside the wheels, I will have to go back and erase not just the active layer right now, but the layer underneath that, since that is negative space. And that'll come into play a little bit later when we put a background in here and add some context. Here I'm grabbing the airbrush. That'll give it somewhat of a domed effect. And I wanted to make the transition from the tire to the main surface of the wheel a little bit different. And I struggled to fill that area, which you can see, which again goes to the tolerance settings of your fill tools. So this is on a different layer than the rest of the wheel that I'd created. I want this to maybe have a little bit more of a shiny finish. So by locking the transparency, coming back in with the white airbrush, I was on the wrong layer. And make that pop a little bit. Again, just applying the same technique, component by component, part by part, surface by surface in some instances. the wheels obviously are going to have some type of texture on them. And so to create the tread, I'm going to create a custom brush. And to do so, I created that custom brush, and then by going in and double-clicking on the brush properties down there at the bottom, you've got custom texture. And what you want to do is you want to create a large enough brush that can capture that custom texture, and then click on top of it, and it will import that image in. And then you can begin to rotate the texture and tell it to follow your stroke, and that's what I've done here. And by creating that custom texture and that custom brush, once I delete the original, I can use the circle tool and have that texture with the spacing that I created follow the circle. Just a couple of tries to get it right. Copy and paste that over. And here I want to add just a simple shadow. So with the line tool and an airbrush, a fairly small airbrush, I'll just add a horizontal line, denoting the ground and a little bit of a shadow.